financial services is no longer confined to just the definitions of banks or insurance companies, that increasingly the reach in financial services is touching everybody, and it's touching everybody both online and offline and changing quickly.
What India has managed to do in the last 5 years would not have been possible without policy making.
Banks are now being seen as the saviors or the custodians that help in the transition.
I think the area where I think regulation always, has to be careful is that we need to move towards a more principles-based approach.
Opportunity is so massive and huge in the whole thing. I think for the next 10, 15 years, the whole financial service industry, as well as the fintechs, this is going to roll over.
Thanks everybody for coming and joining us today, and thank you for my guests here on the panel for joining us as well. What I might just do is take a second to ask the guests to introduce their background a little bit. I'm Nigel Lee, and I'm the CEO for the Asia Pacific region for Ingenico, which is a retail commerce and payments business, the largest actually globally for delivery of retail commerce. And I think one of the things that we see in the industries that we operate in is that financial services is no longer confined to just the definitions of banks or insurance companies, that increasingly the reach in financial services is touching everybody, and it's touching everybody both online and offline and changing quickly. In that construct, I think there are three components that I think are very interesting that we'll talk about today. That there's the component which is about the electronic nature of financial services, how it's changed dramatically from simply being a delivery mechanism through bricks and mortar and through paper and stamps and signatures to being electronic in every sense. And India's probably a prime example of that, with over a billion people or 100 crore of people having access to the internet, and 1.2 billion or 120 crore of mobile phones in the country. The introduction, of course, in addition to that, the second E is that we're finding that financial services are being embedded everywhere. And we'll talk a lot about that with our guests today. With the introduction of UPI and with KYC through Aadhaar in this geography, it's created an extraordinary ability for financial services to be able to start to be included in everyday life, included through the use of super apps, and included even through retail at point of sale through QR codes. And I think that's the third component. The third component is about financial services increasingly being available everywhere. And again, we'll investigate that more through the panel and see what that tells us about the way in which those trends are going to develop going forward over the next 5, 10, 20 years here in India. But let me first of all perhaps ask my panel members to introduce themselves. Would you like to go first, Ravi?
Okay. So, I'm Khandelwal. I am the CEO at Deutsche India, and at the same time, I'm also responsible as a global CIO for corporate function at Deutsche Bank. Looking forward for the good interaction.
Great.
Hi everyone, good morning. My name is Varun Sridhar. I'm the CEO of Paytm Money. I've been with Paytm for about close to a couple of years now. I'm a Gurgaon boy now in Goa, and very happy to be back here again, and looking forward to this conversation. Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you, Varun. And over to you.
Yeah, morning everyone. I'm Sarbvir. I'm the CEO of Policybazaar. We are India's largest insurance intermediary, and look forward to this discussion. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarbvir. And finally to Ravi.
Yeah. Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Gopal. I'm the CEO for Barclays Bank here in India. I have over 30 years experience in financial services. And I think if I look back to the day when I joined the industry, I think I couldn't be more excited about it than now 30 years later. So looking forward to this conversation.
Great. Thank you very much, Ram. And so a panel of CEOs and a panel of CEOs from different parts of the industry. We have bankers, we have wealth managers, we have fintech players, and we have insurance. And I think it's going to be therefore a good discussion about the representation of of how the industry is developing. And maybe let me ask perhaps a question to maybe you, Varun, first, because you get to go first, which is what do you see as being some of the key components, key trends that have happened here? That, and I know you've done a lot of work we were talking about in Europe as well. What's the difference here? What's been happening that's really allowed financial services in this geography to be developing as fast as it has?
I think India has clearly maybe shown the world what fintech, what technology could really outplay as a country, as an economy, right? And if you look at it, I came back to India 2015. I used to live in Paris before, and I came back to India. And one of the things you've seen in the last 5 years is explosion of payments, explosion of payment, fintech-related services, right? And I think it's happened on the back of three main drivers, if you may. Driver number one, and I think we have to be very, very grateful and very praiseworthy of our government, administrative services, regulators, right? As much as we would like to say, hey, they don't do whatever they do, we will always have criticism. But I think what India has managed to do in the last 5 years would not have been possible without policy making. And I think that's the first point. That's one of the drivers. The second point, I think, is the Indian consumer. I love the Indian consumer because the Indian consumer wants everything cheap, wants everything outstanding quality, wants everything very fast, and wants everything at the highest possible satisfaction, right? And it's a very tough challenge because they push you so much that I think India innovates like never before. And I think that's the second big driver. And the third big driver, I think what's changed in India in the last 10 years is the growth of startups. One of the biggest problems in India was capital. Talent was always there, right? India produces more engineers than anybody else, more mathematicians, doctors, you name it, right? Any field, I think we produce more intellect. But the problem was capital, right? So there were these, I would say, foreign capital, which could beat us in a game, right? And so if you're playing poker, the person who has more capital normally tends to win. But I think that changed in the last 10 years with capital becoming easily accessible to startups. And this whole startup ecosystem that's developed in India, I think, has driven that success. So these are the three big factors. And I think that's why I keep telling people the next 10 years, watch for India.
Yeah. And Varun, I see the industry as a whole across most of the regions, and there are very real differences. And I think the regulatory differences is a really interesting one because it has allowed the industry here to grow so extremely fast.
Absolutely.
But the technology components here, necessity is the mother of invention, and India's challenge and its opportunity is, I guess, to be able to get to the large populations here and the large reach and the lowest levels of the society. And I wonder, Dilip, your background is both in technology and in financial services as well.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about Dilip. How do you see the technology component having an impact on the way banking is operating and on the way we have financial services reach?
So again, maybe one comment on Varun. I think one of the massive opportunities, what he's talking is specifically in the fintech side or the penetration in India. We have 1.3 billion people. And so far, whatever has happened at the tip of the iceberg. And you take any kind of service or insurance or any kind of thing that you want to build from a tech, which can impact. I always say this. India, wherever you go, you have all kinds of problems. And every problem, I always tell this, this is an opportunity. An opportunity is basically a startup. So the opportunity is so massive and huge in the whole thing. I think for the next 10, 15 years, the whole financial service industry, as well as the fintechs, this is going to roll over. To your question, Nigel, on what is happening globally and from a large extent for the banks, what you're operating and what you see for India, I think if you look from a pure large financial institution, which is global in nature, they of course have a legacy of what has been run for a very long period of time. They of course are very heavily regulated, and have a huge amount of legacy as a system which is running. So I think most of the stuff, what is happening in the large banks or the large is to first simplify those stuff, what is required and not required. I can tell you a story around even in Deutsche Bank is the first thing what we're trying to do is we operate thousands of customers or thousands of systems. The first thing we're trying to eliminate is, can you reduce the footprint of the system or the applications you run by 1/3, basically eliminating a lot of and simplification of the stuff what we're trying to do. Then the second step is, of course, once you simplify those stuff, you typically try to run with huge monolithic applications and large applications, which has been successful for a lot of period of time. In today's environment, it will not work. So what you're looking there is to re-architect, you build those applications, but build it in a cloud native way, so that you build in a small microservices, small app based, where you can build it once, whatever platform you select, and then a lot of people can use and start using this application team in a larger way. So I think there's a lot of effort in the large companies towards simplification of the systems of the landscape, because of the legacy, and slowly re-architecting and moving them towards the public cloud, which is basically the API base. So you build this application once, and all of them can use it in a large way. I think the future, what I see is, even if a bank or a particular company does in a way, it is not necessary that the same company will do it. In future, you will start seeing, if the applications, or let's say payment as a service, is successful, then why to keep it in that firm? Why can't you sell this as a service? So I think it also goes in the same directions of leveraging much more of an application which you build in a particular company, but can also be leveraged by someone else. So I think I see a massive opportunity for those things also from India point of view as well.
No, Dilip, that's I think super interesting. I want to pick up on the point and maybe ask Sarbvir a little bit about this. Policybazaar is not an insurance company, yeah, but yet you are probably the largest insurer via proxy in the country, and it's a good example of where actually regulation and tech components have come together. So I'm just wondering, as you see the next stage of growth, is it only an online play, which has largely been the play for the first stage of your growth as Policybazaar? Is it more than that? How do you get beyond that?
Sure. At Policybazaar, you're right in saying that initially we were an online company, and but we always had telesales. So we always had assistance, because insurance is a complicated product, and it's not possible for people to understand insurance and buy on their own. What we are doing now is the next logical extension of that. We are now speaking in 13 languages. So our advisors can now speak in different languages as per the requirement of the customer. The second thing we have done is that we have now opened centers in 6 cities. So we are now in a position to not only offer you a tele or a video consultation, but we are also in a position to offer a face-to-face meeting if somebody wants. And what we find is that as you go deeper into the market, there are many people who don't want to buy unless they have met somebody. Yep. So what we are saying is that the whole point of Policybazaar is to create a pull for insurance. Once there is a pull for insurance, we can satisfy that demand through any medium, whether it's online, offline, or in-person meeting. So I think the medium matters less. It's more about the intent which matters.
But it's what I find interesting, and I think is related to Dilip's comment as well, is that again, not being an insurer, and yet being able to have a financial service and provide that through customer sets. Maybe that sets a trend, and perhaps that's a discussion we might come back to you about, Varun, which is the trend around non-financial players being able to embed financial services or deliver financial services.
Let me just quickly address that. So we are a regulated entity. So we are regulated by the insurance regulator. So while we are not regulated as an insurer, but we are regulated. And the second thing, which I think is your larger point, is that the lines are blurring between who is an insurer, who is not an insurer, who's a broker, who's a bank. And I think we are participating in that change and saying that it's not about, the label that you have, but it's about the job that you do. Yeah. And we are now focused on risk, as we were discussing before we started this panel. So we are focused on risk. We are focused on obviously distribution. And I think that's the way the world is moving, that, things are going to get mixed up. And I don't envy the job of regulators, because they do have to keep things, sober as well.
Yeah, and we'll come back to regulators in a second, because I know Varun and I talked a lot about it just before the session here. But I do want to talk, Ram, to you a little bit about the wealth side of financial services, and how do you see that changing here in India through the lens? Because clearly, I think the first step in change has been the reach of payments, and we were talking earlier about payments being perhaps the age from 2010 to 2020 has been the age of payments, with the introductions of that reach component and being able to touch everybody. But the next stage, as Indians and the Indian community has become more wealthy, it's really about wealth-related products. Insurance is one, but Ram, I'm curious about what you're seeing from your perspective as the Barclays lead. Yeah.
Thanks, Nigel. I think as intermediaries in the financial services industry, being the intermediaries between providers of capital and those that depend on capital, and the startup ecosystem being one, which has a large demand on capital. I think we see 3-4 trends. I think the first big one is one which Nigel, you alluded to earlier, about this theme about everybody wanting to be a super app. I think if I looked at 20 years ago, we had one device for phone, we had one device for, let's say, a camera, we had yet another iPod for music. We used to log into multiple different apps, whether it is appointment for a doctor or whether we want to do shopping. Now what is happening is, from omni-channel, which was possibly what was in vogue a decade or so ago, now we've moved from omni-channel to omni-functional. People want to be everywhere. And as banks, I think there are a couple of options therefore, right? One is, I think you spoke about it, Nigel, about being embedded in it, being a super app themselves. Or you kind of relegate the client interface to some of these new age companies, and you say, okay, my forte is managing regulatory burden or compliance burden and the infrastructure and the technology. So you do something that is now in vogue called banking as service. So you have a little bit of a trade-off there. I think that is one theme going on. And while it is clear that the status quo is possibly not great, both of these choices have inherent issues. I think that's one large theme. Second, as intermediaries, what we see is, I think green is for real, as in, I think there is so much said, written, evolving regulations around how investments go to sustainable projects. And, if you think about, typical intermediaries, you have a bit of, again, a trade-off. Do we stop funding some of these polluters, which represent big revenues for large firms? In fact, I think there was one survey which said that in the last 4 years, about 60 banks together have financed close to 3 trillion for the fossil fuel industry. So that represents a big revenue. So do we forsake that and get onto this bandwagon about trying to fund a transition for companies who are now trying to, in quotes, save the world? So that's another theme. So as people who are bringing in money for players, it is important for us to take a call between where you want to play in the spectrum. Again, there are pros and cons. Then the third piece that I see is on ecosystems, which is very close to what we spoke about, embedded finance. I think it is very clear that being solo, trying to win the world, I think is possibly passé. I think what is now in vogue is how do we form partnerships in order to try and win clients in segments that thus far was not economical for you to venture out on your own. So, across the table itself, there are many examples of that happening. And then finally, I think I would, the theme that I see is one on talent. I think gone are the days where I think as an investment bank, you had this day zero placements. I think now, possibly, Policybazaar and Varun's shop would possibly have more takers than old investment banks, not to count or not to talk about this great resignation wave that's upon us. So these are large 4 themes that we see as financiers.
No, look, thank you, Raman. I think I'll pick up on a couple of those. I think one of them that I do find very interesting, because again, I see it across multiple geographies, and it's particularly true here in India and true across the rest of Asia, where the construct of the interface to the consumer is no longer necessarily the brand that is a bank, the brand that is an insurer. It's becoming, it seems, much more an interface of an ecosystem play. And so we have one of the ecosystem players here, represented by Varun for Paytm. And I just as a juxtaposition, I see a number of those players across geographies, Grab Financial across Southeast Asia, Gojek within Indonesia, Alipay being the prime example of the starter of that process through India. And I'm just wondering, when you're an ecosystem player, the change from being not quite a monoproduct, but at least a financial services organization that delivers one or two or three touch points with the consumer is different. When you're an ecosystem player, you have many touch points with the end consumer. How does that affect the way in which financial services are able to be delivered? What does that mean for you in terms of data? What does that mean for you in terms of choices that you can make?
A very nice complex question. I would have to speak for hours to explain Paytm Strategy. I'll try and make it simple. For most of you who do not know it, and I'll try and explain Paytm in 3 silos or 3 units or 3 verticals, if you may. The first vertical is payments, which you all know. Just a quick raise of hands. How many of you are Paytm customers or have used Paytm sometime? Yeah, that's typically right. That's what makes us first in India. But that's our payment business. What most people don't know is our payment business is great because of people like you, which is the consumers, and I'll say thank you, but also because of merchants, right? So we are an ecosystem player. We are India's largest merchant ecosystem by far, right? So that's the first vertical, 20 million plus merchants, right? The second vertical then is e-commerce services, which are things like recharge. So you can recharge your bills, school fees, insurance policies, all of that, your car FASTag. Then we have something called Paytm Insider, which is ticketing, so live concerts, right? So if you're a Farhan Akhtar fan, right, like I am, then you go see him online and you can do a bunch of stuff. So that's the second business, e-commerce, ticketing, travel, roads, buses. The third, which is the newest baby, is the financial services, right? And I'm part of it. I'm part of something called Paytm Money, which does stockbroking. There's insurance, there is lending, right? And there's mutual funds, gold, and all of that. Now, I think fundamentally, there are 2 or 3 tenets. The first tenet is we always started this mission saying we will have 500 million Indians being financially meaningfully included in a happy way, right? And that was tenet 1. The tenet 2 was we'll do it using technology, right? And I'll give you examples of all this in just a bit. And the third was price it in a way for a consumer in which the consumer enjoys, and that's why the adoption. Right, now let me ask you a second question, and again do a show of hands if you don't mind.
No, go.
Right, how many of you have invested in a stock or a mutual fund? Right, now, yeah, stocks or mutual fund, please raise your hand so I can just get a quick feeling, yeah. Right, some time back, and I can tell you 2 years back, that number was 5%. Today it's almost 60%, right? And if you haven't, you should, right, by the way. But what's happened? Now, somebody like Paytm, what we said is we have this huge consumer ecosystem and we have this huge merchant ecosystem. Can something like Paytm Money come and disrupt mutual funds and equity broking, right? And I'll give you 2 examples. Today, we have 1 customer for mutual fund in 99% of all PIN codes in India. Why did that happen? Because we reduced the minimum SIP amount to 100 rupees. Most banks wouldn't even entertain you at 1,000 or me. But we said, okay, let's make it 100 pure digital, online, 1 click done, right? The second thing we did in stockbroking, we are, the youngest broker. We are almost a year old now. Is all of India trades at about 20 rupees a trade. So when you trade, you pay 20 rupees. We did it at 10 rupees. How did we do it? Because of technology, right? Which is the second tenet.
Yep.
Where what we said is because we are an ecosystem, my cost of acquiring you is 0. We don't advertise. You'll never hear Paytm Money advertising for stockbroking. But many of you will end up becoming my customers because the product's great, the technology that we build is great, and the pricing that we bought instead of 20, we made it 10. So we bought all of the pricing that all of you pay by half, right? Now, how did we do it? 80% of my team is in technology, right? So we are a very, very tech and product company. And I think that's what ends up making the difference. So I think the key in an ecosystem is to keep your tenants, or what I would call the moat of the company, alive.
I think so thank you for that, Varun, because I think that's a good, it was a bit of an advert for Paytm, but we'll let you have that. But I think the interesting point, though, is that multi-touch points can only be delivered through technology choices. And I also think as well, I mean, it almost is the case that in theory, the other panelists here actually can be both customers as well as competitors for Paytm, for an ecosystem player. So I think that's quite curious. And one thing I am curious about as well, though, is we talked a little bit about this before. I'm going to direct this one to you, Dilip, which is the nature of the way in which regulation has enabled that to happen here. Whereas juxtaposition that with Europe, where I know you have also had some experiences too and some views on how that is not the case in places like Europe.
So I think, I mean, from the background, I mean, I worked 18, 19 years at SAP. Before a couple of years back, I moved into the banking side and working for Deutsche Bank. And I mean, largely when you move between two companies, you always look at the culture and those aspects and all those things. I mean, largely for me, that was not that much of a bigger difference. But the biggest surprise for me was, I mean, I always knew that it is very regulated, but didn't knew that it is that deeply regulated. And more specifically, if you're coming from Europe or in the US, which is far more mature as a banking industry, and there's a lot of things which is highly regulated in whatever you do. I mean, so if you typically look at large book of work and the requirements which is come, it's very, very regulated to that extent in Europe as well as in the US, which is very, very different. But when you, like Varun was rightly saying, when you come to a country like India, the regulations are still evolving, and there is a lot of good work which is being done in a way that the regulations are not, let's say, going and hindering to what you want to do as a part of the process. So, which is very, very different from the other geographies. I think it will evolve and it will become much more stringent to a certain extent. By the moment, it is very, very, to having good discussions with the regulators, they understand the piece, and you can offer certain kind of service and things in India, which is a lot more difficult in those kind of environment in Europe. So I think for that point of view, it is a massive, massive opportunity. So whether it is you call in the banking side or the insurance side, I think it's very, very different mindset you play in. The second aspect, I think, when you which I always say, I mean, from a regulations, I think you will start to see much more a visible impact. I mean, there's a lot of work that still needs to happen, whether it is on the credit side. I mean, you look at, when I say credit side, it's basically you buy now and pay later, or a lot of the small services which has not deeply penetrated into India. Those are the things where if you start engaging with the regulators and all those things, I think you start to see much more of a better approach in handling those situations, which is very different in the European base. So I think if you compare the regulations which are there in India, I think it's still not that far or so stringent, and they're much more open. On the other side, when you want to start doing something in the likes of Europe, or, I mean, you need to make them understand why you need to do this. I mean, if it is not fitting in their umbrella or the bucket, it's typically will be no to start with, and then you need to explain and start doing the stuff. I mean, which is very, very different. So when you want to move towards, let's say, from a legacy into a cloud world, or you want to break this big monolith and start building those small applications onto the cloud, you need to explain them why you're doing it, why it is so secured, why it has a right control mechanism. They will always ask you questions around, is it secure, is it controllable, and all those things. So I think in that angle, India is much more ahead and much more progressive compared to, but maybe it is a matter of time. Over a period of time, they will also get mature, and we want to just secure the industry in the right way. So I think I see very, very positive out of this for India.
And I mean, I certainly agree, and I see the difference between, for example, Indonesia and India, and the way in which the two geographies have developed in the financial services space, that actually Indonesia has been held up by regulation because they imposed regulations which are similar to the European regulations. Whereas I think in India, what I see is the Indian regulators recognizing that their objective is about trying to help India grow macroeconomically and be able to get included as a result of that. And it's a very different objective, and therefore the regulatory approach seems to be very different as well. And I know, Varun, you're a big fan.
No, I'm a big fan of the Indian regulator. I get regulated by SEBI. And I can tell you, I'm super impressed by two things. First, I think the Indian consumer, the Indian society is pushing and hungry, right? And on the other side, I see the regulator displaying the same hunger, like you mentioned, about economic development, about getting the users at mass, engaged, and advanced. But what I really love is they're not forgetting their primary duty to protect. Yeah. Right? The primary duty of the regulator is to protect the consumer. So they are willing to go a bit ahead and then say, okay, now it's time to pause. And I'm in admiration of the last 7-8 years of what India has done.
Yeah. And Sarbvir, how has that helped you in the Policybazaar business?
So insurance is a slightly different situation because what happens in insurance is that you pay first, and then the amount will come to you later if there is something happening. So I think the regulation has to be much stricter than any other business because otherwise it can lead to a lot of issues. I think in insurance the regulator has been, again, as Varun was saying, has been fairly forward looking. If you look at the last 2 years in COVID, a lot of digitization of the industry has happened simply because the regulator has mandated it. So I think what may have taken us another decade to do happened like in a couple of years. I think the area where I think regulation always has to be careful is that we need to move towards a more principles based approach to say that this is the principle. I want to develop the market. I want to ensure the consumer interest is protected, but not get into too much micro stuff. So I think that's where sometimes the challenge comes for us. Because as you were pointing out, we are not an insurance company, and sometimes it can be seen that we are doing things which are more akin to what an insurance company should do. Now we are doing it because of consumer interest, right? We are saying that the consumer doesn't care whether you're an insurance company or not. They need certain things from you, and I think that sometimes clashes. But I think the dialogue is very constructive, and I think every year we move forward, and I think things are getting better.
No, thank you, Sarbvir. And I think, and Ram, I'm curious because you mentioned this quite clearly about the potential route and choice for a bank in order to perhaps think about whether or not you're going to continue to be a direct-to-consumer organization, or whether or not actually banking as a service is a legitimate strategy where the core competencies of a bank are around compliance and management of risk and liability. Do you see that banks in India are going to end up having to make choices around where they want to play in the ecosystem as a result?
Yeah, Nigel, I think from an evolution standpoint, I feel that, especially after what we've been through the last 24, 36 months, I think there are one of three choices, I would think, right? One is, what's happening is the context is that some of your market share is being eaten away by some of these, insurgents. And therefore, you have choices in front of you. You continue to believe that you will bring your, trust is possibly something that's in your favor. Capital base and captive client base is possibly in your favor as a large incumbent. But I think, the choices that you have in front of you are one that if you want to try and look at revenue streams which are currently not limited only to financial services, then we get into the embedded finance side of things, which is, can I put myself into flows that I do not, necessarily see that today. And there is a whole body of work around trying to create both ends, right? You talk about, you heard about, you've written about, you've read about where technology companies slowly but surely seem to move into the financial services space. Yeah, so likewise, from a bank perspective, you can try and move into some of those consumer areas that you've not been there before. The second choice you have is, as you rightly said, because currently, the regulatory parameter is a little gray. Our fintechs, from Policybazaar side, I think Sarbvir was very clear that he was being regulated, but there are new evolving areas where it isn't very clear whether those are in the zone of being regulated. Digital assets is one. We are possibly going to be talking about that soon. Then we could possibly think about decentralized finance. Now, if you think about bond issuances, which is one of the bread and butter for the traditional investment banks, now can we issue digital bonds? That is in vogue in Europe, for example. France, for instance, have regulations that support digital issuances. So what is inside regulation, what is sitting outside? So that regulatory perimeter is still pretty diffused. In those circumstances, then you kind of say that there is possibly a lot of burden that banks carry, and if that then becomes your competence, then you move into a model where you don't necessarily front face with clients, but you try and use your infrastructure and your regulatory relationships and your over the period of time your mastery on that topic to be able to win business. So I think these are choices. None of it is easy ones. So certainly there is. Just on regulation, there were a couple of things that also I wanted to mention. I think I fully second what I think the panel was saying about how in India we've seen a progressive environment. I think you can bucket this in my mind in three slots. I think the foundational ones they continue to be focused on, which is around governance. I think off and on, I think we have incidents where we all wonder how it happened in the first instance, and we continue to have those surprises come in. So focus on getting corporate governance right, core risk management in place that continues to be happening, capital, liquidity. Those are, I think, traditional areas where the regulators are focused on. There are some areas where there has been accelerated focus, right? I think because of the pandemic, I think technology resilience or overall operational resilience, I think, has been a topic that has come to the fore. And we mentioned about ecosystem play and therefore third-party risk management. Where does the regulatory risk sit in this embedded finance, in this ecosystem play? I think that is another area that has been accelerated. And then data. I think one of the things that is coming in the way of even faster adoption of everything digital is this fear of how data is being used, fraud and all of that, right? So I think those areas are being accelerated. I think in terms of, in my mind, areas of the future, I think frontier, one I think is, we spoke about that earlier, about green and therefore climate risk and how that plays into financial risk as everybody transitions into a green economy. I think that's of a very big importance to the regulator, specifically banking regulator, because banks are now being seen as the saviors or the custodians that help in the transition. And finally, I think on digital assets, and I spoke about the confusion about where the perimeter sits, I think that is also an evolutionary area of regulation. So I think business model is evolving and regulators are also trying to keep in step. So that's the word.
No, thank you very much, Ram. And I'm conscious we've got about 5 minutes or so, maybe a little bit more. And I wondered whether the audience themselves had any questions for the panel here. Clearly they do, which is... so if you can maybe ask your question and then see who perhaps might want to pick it up.
Hello, sir. Good morning to everyone. Hello. Yeah. Good morning to everyone. Sir, actually, I have one question. Like, we are growing in the field of fintech. Like, in few years, we are the leading in fintech. But where are we going in financial literacy?
I think it's an interesting question. I know, Ram, that was partly the question I was posing to you about what do you think about what will happen to banks as a result.
Yeah. I think you touched on something very pertinent. I think it is unlike some of the other markets. I think we have an issue around digital literacy, financial literacy. So I think when we talk about blockchain, crypto, and we think that those could be solutions for financial inclusion, I sometimes wonder whether those complex technologies are something that, broadly we would be easily able to adopt. So this is a challenge of our times. And I think anybody who has digital aspirations, and I think it is possibly everybody here today, I think we certainly have to move the needle on literacy. So it is a pressing topic. Lots are being done. Lots still need to be done.
Do you mind if I can answer?
I was just say, so Varun, the bank's going away.
Yeah, no, I love the question for one reason. We produce the greatest chartered accountants, architects, doctors, data scientists. You know the funny part? Ask an Indian at 35, how do you invest 500 rupees and choose a product they'll not know? Because we don't teach finance when we are that small, right? And I think the biggest change that India actually needs in the education system is to make finance mandatory, right? And I think the minute all of us start to learn financial, we work very hard to save wealth at the end of the day, right? Wealth is not happiness, but 60% or 50% of your life is equal to money. Not having it makes it a problem. So we work very hard, but nobody unfortunately teaches us. And I think it's for people like us, the regulator, the government, to start taking that responsibility. We take it seriously, but I know a lot of financial institutions do. But yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. The fact that you ask already makes me more proud that young India will do well. Right?
Yeah. No, thank you for the question. Definitely. We have another question here too.
Yes. I have a basic question that how do we balance traditional banking with the fintech's innovation? Because with the traditional banking, we are able to, for example, the banker is able to, look at the viability of the project. And you were talking about the climate sustainability. He's able to check whether the project is sustainable and all. But with the, fintechs, etc., the collateral, etc., is not easily, can't easily be processed. There are too many NPAs taking place as far as with the banking is concerned, and we are seeing with the such type of scam, for example, with the GameStop, Robinhood is type of scam taking place in the West, etc. So it will become like traditional banking will become like speculative banking. We saw in the 07 crisis also, a global financial crisis, loose regulations, etc. So how can we better balance the traditional banking with this, because sometimes slowness also brings a lot more what you call lot more viability as far as the business models are concerned.
So let me maybe ask if Dilip you want to take that one, because I think it is always an interesting question about whether or not financial services is about protection, which is I think what Dilip was describing about Europe, or whether it's actually got a responsibility to grow the economy, and therefore, and I think it's got both. And so I'm curious to see what your thoughts are there, Dilip.
There has to be a balance. I think there is an advantage of banking, and the banking has an advantage. They have run this. They know how things run over the period of years. They know how to scale. They are globally available. They know how the regulations works and all those things. So there is an advantage of this stuff. Where they get stuck and where the startups can be a huge help is in the new areas, right? And where you can be a front end for a lot of topics. Let's say, example, you talk a topic like, in digital insurance or in any of the small banking, where you start identifying those small applications which can be built but can be leveraging bank in a right way. So I think if you can have the right balance, you have for both sides it can work, because the banks can help with the knowledge and the experience of scale, whatever you call the note with the regulators and the global reach and all those things. And at the same time, the innovations and all those things can also come from the large fintechs. And let's say, I always say this, look at country like India, where it's so underly penetrated. If you have a lot of these creative ideas and creative things which can come to the front, and then you can have a back end and the bank which are running and supporting this stuff, it can be a huge opportunity for working together. So I think it is if you can work this out as a right partnership, I think it is valid for everyone to work and can be a huge success for a country like India as well.
And Varun, I guess in that question, data matters. And the more touch points you have of data, I suspect the better you're able to understand the customer, but also protect the customer as well.
Absolutely. I think data protection is so important. And he spoke about climate and balance and all of that. I think that's, whether you're a fintech or whether you're a traditional player, I think every institution has a responsibility to do good. That's not going away, right? And I think the ecosystem coming together will help. And just on the data point, I think 5G coming in is going to change India, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what we should look forward to. How do you do it responsibly is our job, right?
No, absolutely. I'm conscious that I'd love to take another question, but I'm conscious that we're out of time. I'd like to, if I can, ask you to, I'd first of all like to thank my co-guests here on the panel, Dilip and Varun, and Sarbvir and Ram. And if I can, I'd like to thank you as an audience for both your time and your questions. And if you would join me as well in thanking the panel, I'd be much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you also to Nigel.
Thank you very much.
absolutely.
I would like our director, Mr. Dhruv Bell, to give our mementos to all the distinguished speakers on the dais. We'll start with our moderator. Thank you for being so effective. That was Mr. Nigel Lee. The next we have Mr. Varun Sridhar. He is CEO of Paytm Money. Sarbvir Singh, CEO of Policybazaar. Dilipkumar Khandelwal from Deutsche, India. And Mr. Ram Gopal, who is CEO of Barclays Bank, India. Thank you so much. Can we have a round of applause, please? It's in the morning. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.